Hi, Matt.
Hi, Ann Althouse. How you doing?
Hi, Matt Welch. How are you doing?
I
I'm doing a little. Things are a little iffy out here in Madison, Wisconsin. I'll talk about that later.
talk about that
But
now, actually, because that's just so bizarre. You weren't allowed legally to work yesterday.
oh yeah, it's a funny state out here. But we have our budget crisis, and under the previous governor, Jim Doyle, the approach was to have furlough days. And there's some legal reasons for doing furlough days having to do with labor law and also having to do with preserving retirement benefits and things like that. But the result of it is that there were actually rules against working. I was not allowed to work. And as a law professor, just about any kind of reading in my field or looking at my email or writing is going to be in violation of the law. So not only am I not paid for the day that I'm off, and I think for a lot of people being required not to work would just be a benefit. I don't have to, clean the floor or whatever my job is. I don't have to sit at a desk. But for me, it meant that it was actually illegal for me to read. A Supreme Court case came out yesterday that I would normally want to blog about and just hit the ground running and get into a whole dialogue about the Fourth Amendment. And I felt like, well, gee, I shouldn't have even looked at the front page of the New York Times because now I see it. I better not read that case or I'll be violating the law.
Now, did you guys receive instruction on this stuff?
Oh, yeah. I could
whatever
link
you
to
do, make sure not to open up the newspaper today, or
Yeah, I don't know. The danger of the danger of violating these rules by just reading in the normal way. I mean, was I not supposed to look at my computer at all? Was I not supposed to think? The state was controlling me yesterday. I laughed because I actually assume they won't really enforce these rules in a draconian way, but the rules are there to be invoked when it's convenient.
this is always when
grasp its iron
at
fist.
some point, like both general labor union rules, and I've got nothing wrong, nothing against, in theory, private sector labor union. But when you start hearing the minutiae of rules, sometimes then it gets even more sort of hellishly boring and stupid on the public sector level. You start to say, hey, this isn't really just passing the basic, make any sense at all kind of test.
Yeah.
21st
And
century, damn it, we should be able to read the New York Times.
And you feel like, well, these rules can't possibly be the rules, right? But, I mean, if it were a situation where people wanted to retaliate against you or there was some kind of an investigation against you, these would be all the things that they would bring out. I mean, I think about the case of Ward Churchill at the University of Colorado, who people got upset with because of something he said about 9/11. You remember that case?
I think
And then
they're
they
mostly
started
upset
going,
with his ponytail, really.
yeah, it's a, what? Did you say something about a ponytail?
Yeah, I mean, part of the response against Ward Churchill was an aesthetic response against a dude who was a caricature of what people thought as a campus lefty jerk off.
But then if you decide, this was one of the problems with the old independent counsel law. If you decide this is the guy we're going to focus on, and then you go back into, well, what violations can we pin on him? There's so many rules. There's so many ways you can run afoul of these rules that you didn't really believe could be serious, if they decide to invoke them on you. Now, of course, people will say, oh, Althouse sounds paranoid, right? But that's another pushback. You sound paranoid if you say, hey, I'm worried about these rules. If I take these rules seriously, they mean I really shouldn't dare to even open up my computer lest I see a story about the law. But I guess this proves I'm not paranoid because I'm not really worried that people will look at this blogging heads and say, hey, I got an idea of a way to screw Althouse. She must have violated those furlough laws. We can look at her blog posts on all the days that were officially furlough days. Did she ever talk about the law? Is there anything that she wrote that could be construed as being within her jobs? Or did she carefully limit her topics on the furlough?
This is sounding a lot like a Gary Hart monkey business moment, Anne. I think you might
follow
want to
me
swap this
around.
backwards.
Maybe we shouldn't put this back. I dutifully... But and do you think that violates free speech? I'm sure that there are, I couldn't even have this discussion yesterday. Just thinking about whether I could do this or whether I would have an argument that it violates free speech if they invoke the rules on me for doing that, for reading that, for thinking that, for writing that.
A little known
the mere fact that I thought about whether that would violate my First Amendment rights, that was within the scope of my job because I do teach First Amendment, and I am a law professor. And so, I probably should have gone into had some coma-inducing drug lest I violate the law.
I haven't seen this much paranoia, and since the last time I went to a normal convention in Portland, Oregon. I am a college dropout, and proudly so, but I at one point did work as an employee for the University of California system, and a little known fact, at least as of 1987 or 8, I think when I started, is that you have to sign, in order to have employment there, you have to pledge an oath or sign an oath that you will uphold the Constitution of the state of California. And I fought like a bastard to try to get out of that because I don't want anyone making me sign no damn oaths or take a drug test or anything, kind of compulsion thing. And of course, there wasn't really any way out. There's a condition of my employment, but it strikes me as one of the many oddities, absurdities, and frankly unpleasant trees of working for state university system. It's otherwise can be a terrific job for a lot of different reasons, but you're working for the government at a place that's supposed to be about free speech, and there's just essential conflicts into that enterprise. But speaking of essential conflicts,
and in the future, can I just say that in the future we'll all be? It's more and more that we're going to be working for the state, and wasn't that what was it Rand Paul or Ron Paul? Rand Paul was talking about with respect to the government health care. If it's all working for the government, then all of these will be signing away our rights in order to have our jobs.
He was using the slavery analogy, which I was not the world's biggest fan of, but other people found that I'm holding up right now the cover story that I wrote about the Rand Paul, in which I called him the most interesting man in the Senate, and right on cue, he equated government-run healthcare with slavery. No, I mean there's a point to be made that we will, if the more that government gets involved, the more that we work for or at the kind of pleasure of or analysis of governments, whether it's or that we engage in transactions that the government decides that it needs to observe in some way. This is sort of the result. I mean, the point of the road to serfdom wasn't necessarily to say that regulations equal communism, but it's more that step by step, this is the direction, and it's not a necessarily pleasant direction, and this is a way to talk about something that otherwise people will just sort of say, hey, we're just trying to create a level playing field, where establish some basic rules of the road. Well, no, there's a qualitative difference when the state is involved with your basic employment and what you can say and what you can't, than if you're not, and it makes me feel grateful that I am not subject. I mean, this it has nothing to do necessarily with anything, but the kind of employment rules that affect public school teachers. I mean, the crazy tenure after 2 years, and the weird committees that can ruin your life based on this or that. There's just all kinds of strictures that come with that. And my wife is French, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Hopefully not about her. But in France, everybody ultimately works as a functionary, as they say, or functionary. You work either as a teacher or a librarian or some kind of state job, and that just means that you sacrifice a lot of just sort of nitpicky freedom, and you probably don't make all that much money as well. And it's a trade-off. And we're so derailed from Arnold Schwarzenegger.
No, but I have a segue. Wait. Listen to this. I have a great segue for what we wanted to talk about first. And that is, when you have a job, it puts a different structure around you from your usual freedom. So if your job is to be a servant in somebody's house, and they make, or a maid in a hotel, you care a lot about that job. And if the people who you're beholden to, who are your clients, your patrons, or who you need to impress in order to keep your job, that's going to put a different freedom binding around your normal freedoms to say no to sex or to get into a situation where you might in fact be raped.
Yes.
Subject, Schwarzenegger and DSK.
Yeah, Schwarzenegger, we're taping this on a Tuesday, and I think the story broke about midnight or something like that in the LA Times, appropriately enough, that Arnold authored a love child with the live-in help who was working in his house for 20 years, who was, I believe, married at the time. He's been providing for the child, and he told Maria that after he served out his term as governor.
Are you believing that? Wait a minute. Are we
This- yeah,
believing Maria didn't know until he
reportedly.
decided to tell her? The baby was born 10 years ago, apparently, or 9 years ago.
Yeah.
And she didn't find out until just now when he decided to tell her because the governorship was up. Are we believing that? I'm not believing that.
I actually believe it. If you're going to, I just do. I have a hard time imagining Maria Shriver being as willing a kind of executioner of the original Gropergate series of stories that the LA Times wrote just before the 2003 special election. She came out and dismissed the allegations, stood by her man, all this kind of stuff. It's a lot harder to put on that face
To
when
me,
you're
it's all
a successful
consistent.
professional woman that she is, when, there's a love child that was born just 2 years ago in your own house. I mean, would you, as any kind of person out there living in the world, would you feel comfortable with the mother of your husband's love child working for you inside of your house along next to your children? It's hard for me to swallow that kind of. I mean, she is a Kennedy in all, and powerful people have different rules, but that's kind of a difficult thing to imagine.
Exactly. It's within the Kennedy culture. Is she not a politically ambitious woman? Is she not hardened and knowing of the ways of the world? Did she not know the kind of man she was married to? Was she not ambitious about that political campaign? She made the speech about him. She, undermined the interests of women who had been harassed, or if that were true. She came to the aid of her powerful man. She propped him up. Did she not want power too? Did she not want that for her family, for her children? The kind of structure of lying in a system like that. To think that she's the innocent one and she just didn't know. I mean, to me, she's discredited either way. Either she knew and she sought power, or she didn't know and she's naive and dumb. I just don't think she's dumb.
She sacrificed. I mean, she's. I don't think the kind of person who would view power as this, once in a lifetime, hardly attainable thing. She was born into it. She was surrounded by it. So I kind of have a hard time imagining her willing to sacrifice all, including what was a very successful journalism career, television career, which she really had to subsume during her first ladyhood of California. And it's hard for me. I'm the chain of the Occam's razor, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, in this case seems to make sense to me. Like, oh, here's the revelation. That's when she decides to divorce him. I don't think for her, the governorship of California was the world's biggest prize. And in fact, they had to endure that first round of Gropergate stories, which certainly, would have placed stress on anybody.
But that was a long time ago. I mean, it could have been that she defended him, and then she later found out about this other thing. At that point, she had been kind of committed to supporting him in his sexual issues. And she had given up her journalism career, and she'd gotten into this kind of system that involved lying about his relationship with women. And then this additional matter came up, and she was kind of burned, but decided to wait out the governorship because she was talked into it or pressured into it, or it was in her interest to do that, or maybe she did it for the children. Hey, I'd like to see a picture of this 10-year-old child. I mean, I have this image of the child looking just like Arnold. If that's the case. She had it now, right? She saw the child.
One thing that I think this brings up is that I think the LA Times was unfairly maligned back in 2003 of trumping up a non-story when they interviewed, I think it was well over a dozen women who reported some kind of unpleasant interaction with Schwarzenegger. And it gets back to what you said when we tried to segue into this segment of it was sort of like abusing power relationships. That was the theme that hit over and over again. I mean, in the stories, the people that he was allegedly groping, squeezing, or whatever were not in positions to say, hey, go screw yourself, pal. They were waitresses. They were people who were like in the makeup chair in Fox News, or they were hostesses or something like that. They were people who in the professional moment couldn't tell the famous man to go take a hike. And he played on that. It was at the time I thought it was it tells you something about a person's character to know that. And I think that's in the public interest to know if he's abusing that kind of authority. The LA Times is criticized, and I think rightfully so, for dropping this story just a mere handful of days before the special election, so you can get the timing issues. But I think the newsworthiness of it stood then and stands now, and I'm curious to hear what people who attacked them at the time will be saying in reaction to this latest bit of news.
What's awful about journalism is the way they have these stories, and the stories may well be true, but it's the filtering. It's the decision of, I'm going to drop it here. I'm going to drop it on this person, but not this person. It's that playing in the political sphere rather than playing it straight. That still deserves criticism. So I don't think that they get off the hook at this point. It's still the same old question, in my view, with respect to the LA Times.
And the
with
LA
respect
Times.
to all sorts of mainstream media, the way they try to make elections come out the way they want. And they have their stories, but they choose when to use it. It's like what I was saying at the beginning of this dialogue about how the state has all of these rules, and people are breaking rules all the time. Wasn't there some article, was this in Reason magazine, about how we're all committing 5 felonies a day? What was that article? Three.
It's based on a book by Harvey Silverglade, which is really great on that topic.
Right, so isn't that similar? Maybe the news media have it's like they have pre-written obituaries. They have their collection of stories that they could drop on various people. If so-and-so decides to run for president or for governor or whatever, we could do this and we could do that. When should we time the rollout? And so the decisions aren't made on ethical journalism grounds. They're made on political grounds. That doesn't depend on whether the stories are true or not.
I would add, and my computer's went suspiciously dark. No, we're okay. That it was also the LA Times that willfully did not cover the John Edwards story, rather famously, that was happening in their own backyard in Beverly Hills Hotel, I believe it was. And you're right, there is a discretion that's placed at that. And I think that even savvier newspaper journalists will acknowledge that there's no way that you can have like a clean, pristine line of when do you write the story and when do you not, and it invites criticism and suspicion and all that. But I mean, this is something to transfer to the Dominique Strauss-Kahn story, the IMF alleged rapist. France is the French journalism culture is awash in so much insider knowledge and gossip, including of DSK's sexual exploits and misbehavior going back decades, going back to his university days, all this kind of stuff. Everyone knows about it, everyone talks about it, and they almost never write about it. And then when the story explodes, suddenly you have this big sort of hand-wringing, oh, maybe we should have said something, maybe we should not have said something. But the overwhelming French journalism culture up until now has been an omerta on this stuff, partly because French culture tolerates a strong amount of just absolute boorishness of its male rock stars, whether intellectual or actual, in ways that is seriously unpleasant. But also because the state is intertwined with media there. And there were stories about Sarkozy's wife having an affair in, I think it was Perry Match, the big and great news magazine there, and very soon afterwards, the Perry Match editor was shown the door because, of course, the head of the publishing group is friends with Sarkozy. The state has a lot of power in appointing editors or approving editors everywhere, and so you have this culture where everyone knows the stuff goes on, and no one writes about it hardly in any circumstances. And then, if anything, sort of rallies around the beleaguered, French libertine who is being marooned by a savage Protestant, American judicial system. Go. Sorry, I launched straight into a DSK, but
that's fine. Well, I mean, I think we should talk about the two things together. I mean, one thing I wanted to say about DSK is that if the story told by the maid is true, why would a man with such power and glamour and ability to attract all sorts of willing women go after the maid in such a crude way? And I think part of the answer has to be that he's been successful doing things like that, and he's just over the years become lax at his technique, since he's gotten women by being fairly blunt and direct and just grabbing what he wants, whatever's near. That's worked enough that he hasn't honed, he's just not bothered with any of the frills. So life ends up working like a porno movie.
France has the
until someone objects,
expectation
and then the
of
person objecting has this story that's so horrible that he gets arrested, and it's obviously attempted rape. But from his point of view, it's probably part of a long chain of behavior in which he thought he was just very sexually successful. The poor man.
The French culture, and it's changing slowly, I'm sure, but there is an expectation if you're an attractive woman that your ass is going to get grabbed on the metro without kind of question about that. It's a very strange paradox for me because in many ways French women in my experience, besides of course French women don't get fat or whatever. But they tend to be more professional, more hardcore, more sort of like the results of feminism than the American women, in my experience. And my experience is totally skewed, but like the majority of French journalists that I've met over my life have been female and just like super hardcore, loving journalism, subsuming family in the background, sacrificing them to get after the story, this kind of stuff. Incredibly professional, successful at parody in many ways. With men in French society, they don't change their names when they get married. They rarely get married. I mean, it's very surprisingly, shockingly common for French couples to cohabitate, and part of it is sort of a feminist critique. So you have this kind of existing feminism, even though French women tend to reject the label and the culture of especially American feminism, and yet at the same time you have this cultural tolerance best exhibited by the absolutely atrocious column that Bernard-Henri Lévy, the scarecrow quote-worthy philosopher of... The
shirt unbuttoner. What did you call him? I actually blogged about that this morning. I thought your phrase was very funny.
Professional shirt unbuttoner. I mean, we have, behind me somewhere is our...
the narcissist millionaire shirt unbuttoner.
Yes. That is an accurate description. He wrote a piece which just drips with this noxious French culture where I can't believe that this, elite man, this person who has saved the global financial system has to be subject, like he was any other person, to these, he used a great word, accusatory American system.
And every paragraph in that article begins with, I am angry because I know this, and in America, a lot of people went after Barack Obama when he announced the shooting in the face of Osama bin Laden because he used the word I too much. But, I mean, get a load of this philosopher. I mean, everything he says is about how he knows and he feels. And basically the tone of it all, quite aside from it all being about him, is him and his friends, his good circle of friends, the people that he knows. They're special. They should not be touched. I mean, the entitlement and the arrogance of it is just completely in your face.
And this is the same guy who went to the wall to defend Roman Polanski by describing what Polanski did to a then 13-year-old girl as a misdemeanor, which I think he might have even put in air quotes. So giving drugs and having sexual intercourse with a 13-year-old is a misdemeanor in the BHL worldview. But it is...
and wasn't part of the argument, he's a great artist.
Yeah.
And so different rules apply to the great man. I mean, it's medieval.
I mean, when's the last time you saw a Polanski movie? I'm not sure The Great Artist
The Pianist. The Pianist was a great movie.
The Piano was okay. I think he had a vampire
Not the
movie.
piano. The Pianist.
Oh, The Pianist, sorry. Speaking of
females.
Speaking of strange females. But no, there's something about this whole episode. There's a recurring tick in French culture, regrettably. In the 1990s, we saw this with the case of filthy Ira Einhorn, as we used to call him on tabloid.net back in the day. He was this awful, counterculture guru type in Pennsylvania who murdered his girlfriend, and he became a cause célèbre in the French countryside.
Was he the Earth Day guy?
I think he was the Earth Day guy, yeah. Where they refused to extradite him to the United States because of America's savage criminal justice system and because maybe he would be subject to the death penalty and blah, 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 blah. And it's just amazing the lengths to which French people will go to defend someone whose crime happened to be against a woman, whether it's rape or absolute or straight out murder, as long as the person is seen as some kind of intellectual, some kind of exalted man about town. There's cases of French rock stars who beat their Polish or Eastern European girlfriend to death in a hotel room. And it's like, it's a crime of passion. And it's like, no, it's not a crime of passion. It's a guy who beat his woman to death. It is an awful, violent crime, and the culture of defending that in the name of being against nasty American puritanical values is just sick. I mean, I will happily cop, and I'm not, but to being a Protestant, if having a Protestant puritanical values means that we do take seriously the complaints of an immigrant, a Muslim immigrant, I might add, from Senegal, against one of the most powerful men in the world, who was in a position of power over her in a business transaction.
Wow. This is interesting, the parallel development of feminism in these two countries. I mean, you spoke about the French, at least career women, as being hardened, but part of their hardening experience is that men are going to grab their ass and all of this sort of thing. But in the end, they get to, at least these elite women, get to better parity because they've been toughened. Whereas in American feminism, there's a lot of victimology, a lot of saying the whole world needs to change so that we feel safe, and we don't have to get hardened. Part of our rights as women is the right to have a world in which women feel comfortable. It's the sort of thing that Rush Limbaugh would call chickification. And who was I reading the other day calling it, the pussification of America, this sort of thing, that women are making America soft and that we want a place that will feel comfortable for women who don't want to speak loudly and don't want to be silenced by the people making them feel bad and so forth. I mean, that sort of path of feminism in America, where does it, it has benefits and problems, but it sounds like the French feminism has gone in a different direction within a different culture. It says something about the overall culture, that the feminism in that culture developed the way that it did.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it, if we're going to be called puritanical Protestants, then I can flip it around and talk about their damn Catholicism, even if they are a Republican country. But there is sort of the Catholic tolerance, or sort of like the binge and purge cycle of you sin and then you express regret and kind of the French poetic, of course he's a man who's familiar with the pleasures of the flesh and this kind of earthly approach, which is quite different than the Anglosphere's sort of more uptight and what are the rules here kind of approach. So you wonder in these cases. We were actually talking about this in the office the other day in the context of healthcare, of all strange things. There's a complaint about healthcare, which is not totally dissimilar to what Rand Paul is talking about, that if the more the government gets involved in healthcare, the more that it's basically going to be in a position to tell people about how what they eat, what kind of lifestyles they have, are they being active enough. They're going to get into people's business in a way. And Nick Gillespie was asking me here, what about in Europe, where you have something much more close to socialized healthcare, although it has differences. And it's interesting, I think, that at least in the few countries that I have some knowledge of, you don't have the same Badinskyism when it comes to judging how other people live their lives or express their habits vis-a-vis, like, hey, I'm paying for your health care, stop eating those donuts, and I, just sort of wondering how much of that is a straight rational kind of look that libertarian economists like to do about, okay, here are the incentives structurally so we can predict X, and how much of it is just sort of a cultural thing. It seems unpleasant to the French cultural pathway to tell people what to do with their powdered donuts, with their foie gras, with their smoking or whatever. And it seems much more probable in an American context to tell you can't drink, period, or you can't do this, or the world's going to end if you have a joint, this kind of stuff. And so maybe culture trumps the sort of incentive structure of laws.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You know, I mean, I think that there are things people would like to say to other people, like you shouldn't eat like that, or you shouldn't smoke, you shouldn't drink, or you shouldn't have such expenses, such a big house, or such a big car. And so, but we know we're not supposed to do that. Then we latch on conveniently to various political issues like global warming or universal health care or something like that. And then that gives us the ability to say that thing we weren't supposed to say. Now we can say it because we're doing it in some different kind of framework of the public good. And it's no longer just our old jealousy, envy, and hey, why is your car so big? Your house is big. Well, global warming. So we're speaking. We got into some higher moral plane that way.
I think you're really onto something with that. I was reminded of that with the story that was in the New York Times yesterday. It was quite possibly the most ridiculous news story I've read in at least a month and a half. That basically said Iraq has suffered through war and pestilence and
the painted buildings.
Stuff. Yeah, but now it's another scourge, tastelessness. Like really, and the whole article was this big complaint about the taste and color in Iraqi buildings and what people are doing with their terrible newfound freedoms.
Yeah,
and that I was alerted to that story by a great journalist who used to work in L.A. now is in Mexico named Daniel Hernandez, and he rightly pointed out that this is the exact same kind of complaint and urge as you see in a lot of places in Southern California, where they pass local housing codes to keep the damn Mexicans from painting their house orange and purple and bright blue the way they do in Mexico. And it's the same kind of thing. You can encase your desire to tell people how they should live with their lives by putting, by affecting your local zoning board, and I think it's an important thing to point out, and something that we obviously do a lot of at the Reason, that the impulse is ugly on some deep level. You can wrap it up in however you like, and that you're looking out for the taste of these poor Iraqis who don't know better. But it's something that I saw a ton of when I was in Eastern Europe in the 1990s. Similar stories, like it's true that they have newfound freedoms here, but they're not using it to read the finest literature. They're buying Stephen King and Danielle Steele.
Exactly.
Isn't that terrible?
Yeah. Well, look what people do with their freedom. They really can't be trusted with their freedom. We really know what's good for you. You could make a free choice, but you're going to make the wrong choice. We need to channel your choices, either restrict them or nudge them with taxing and spending to get you to do what you should be doing anyway. We know better than you what's good for you. I mean, that's a regular theme, especially in democratic politics.
Yeah, and it will be interesting to see how that stuff plays out in Republican politics. That was a nice little segue there. But no, I mean, you see the same kind of discussion. Finally, I think it's sort of overdue on the Republican side of the aisle with Rand Paul rants about your ability to choose your own light bulb. I mean, it really, on an atomized level, individual level, there are people making sure that we have to regulate a transaction on a lemonade stand, and what we went off the rails here somewhere, folks. There's a built-in level of discomfort with people out there making choices, engaging in transactions, doing whatever the hell, without any arbiter sitting back and saying, hey, that is a pretty nice color that you just painted your house. Bravo, way to go.
Did you notice in the New York Times article about the paint colors in Iraq that there was a line that said there's something in Arab culture that says, if you own a house, then you can do what you want with it? Arab culture? Well, I thought that was American culture. You own something, you can do what you want with it. The New York Times called that like some quirk of Arab culture.
There's
what if there were a quirk of Arab culture? What happened to the old sort of postmodernist kind of idea that everything's socially constructed? Where is it written what the right colors are for a house? If it's within the culture of the people in a particular place to paint their house bright orange or some weird pink and orange combination, the idea that that's wrong.
I'm sure the Kurds enjoyed being painted as being part of the Arab culture. No, there's a great thing that was pointed out in the comments of the post when I posted up on Hit and Run, which I didn't realize just because I'm ill-educated, is that the kind of neoclassical white Greek Roman columns everywhere type of school of official architecture that we see.
Brightly painted,
that we see here in D.C., which is all white, all beige, all gray, and for the most part, all really damn ugly, was colorfully painted at the time. The only reason why it was
it would look alien to the ancient Greeks if they could be revived to walk around and look at what we did in their image. They wouldn't recognize it.
And, I wouldn't, those of us who live in the country in Washington as its capital should be very hesitant to throw stones about the beauty of the capital's architecture. This is one of the drabbest, ugliest towns in terms of the official buildings. The Capitol's nice and a couple of other buildings are okay, but the FBI building is, perfectly in place in Ceausescu's Romania. The Department of Energy and agriculture stretches on for 1,000 blocks. It's just low-slung, gray, rectangular vomit everywhere in this town. I really wouldn't go.
Rectangular vomit.
Rectangular vomit. Does that make sense? I don't think so.
In some weird way, it sounds like it'd be very dangerous to vomit rectangles. It might rip out your esophagus. I don't know. I had a grisly image there. But, maybe as a libertarian, you ought to like the fact that the government buildings look like that. They express what government is. They keep people from loving government too much.
That's a point. Look, if you want to love governments, if you want to love just about anyone except perhaps the hired help, Godspeed. But I think it is inevitable that government buildings do end up reflecting the culture and character of a place. Budapest, Hungary, where I lived for 3 years, many of the government buildings were built in 1900, turn of the century, when Hungary was at its imperial zenith, and sort of famously, the stock market building, which is now the TV building, and the parliament were twice as big as any previous parliament or stock market building ever built in the world, and it's a perfect reflection of the kind of Hungarian both insecurity and desire to take advantage of this temporary window in time when they dominated everything from the North Sea down to Croatia. Are we off topic enough yet here?
No. I like the topic of government aesthetics. But we are off topic. I just like the idea of government buildings expressing something about government. We were out in Albany last year looking at the horrible Albany state capitol. Have you ever been there?
No.
It's just insane. And then to know that huge amounts of money were spent on this by people who believed that this is beautiful. It's a very interesting cultural phenomenon to think this is what those people thought was beautiful, thought would make them look great, or however, this says something about the way they wanted to be perceived, and they went so wrong. And speaking of government buildings, I'm out here in Madison, Wisconsin, where we had all of these protests that were very centered on the state capitol building. The state capitol building became iconic, and there were these protests in the rotunda that were, the vision of what all of that looked like is kind of seared into my mind now. But it was a wonderful forum for protest. It's the old-fashioned acoustics in that building from back before there was amplification that made, chanting just a sort of an ecstatic and weird experience, depending on what side you were on. The echoing, the natural amplification, the sense of place, the sense of being in this giant womb of a rotunda was very specific and expressed something. I think it expressed something about free speech. That did you see there was just a case about how there's no right to dance in the Jefferson Memorial?
It's actually a friend, Reason, who was part of that, Brooke Oberwetter, and some people we know, I'm sure it's the same case, decided on, I think, Jefferson's birthday or some holiday to go have a quiet dance party over there, and were arrested by Park Police. So did they come out with a judgment saying once and for all, no dancing on Thomas Jefferson?
Well, there was some case, today, D.C. Circuit decision in Oberwetter v. Hillard, I'm reading from Volokh, concluding that the Jefferson Memorial is a non-public forum in which reasonable viewpoint neutral restrictions are permissible, and therefore the government could bar people from picketing, speech-making, marching, holding vigils, or religious services, and all other like forms of conduct. The plaintiff in the particular case was doing expressive dancing late at night in the Jefferson Memorial.
Yeah.
I thought that, to me, that was very interesting compared to what I saw going on in our state capitol here. Now, of course, there's state constitutional law here, and the state law in Wisconsin is very strong with respect to free speech, specifically in the Capitol. And it's a place where you want to do your protest because the framing of your protest is very magnificent, and it's got this amplification to it, and it's got this round frame around it when you're indoors, and it's got a square to march around when you're outdoors. Constantly we get these protests here where it's done through Facebook organization or whatever, and people drive down or march down and take over the 4 streets around the square and drive around and start doing a whole big march. They can get thousands of people to converge at a particular time, and the police policy is, when that happens, to block the traffic and stop the cars from going onto the square and let the people do it, because the other way around is harder to do, and that's the police policy. And so, that's Madison, Wisconsin, and it's actually pretty amazing.
I heard from some more Republicanoid types in Wisconsin that the protesters there really trashed the Capitol building, and that is seared into public opinion, that they were disrespectful.
Well, it was very important to these people to get on the same page and try to control everyone that was on their side. Sometimes 100,000 people showed up. Now, somebody's going to step on the tulips. Somebody's going to put masking tape on the marble. So some of that will happen. And you have to know that your opponents, including me and my husband, will go over there and take the photographs of everything that's bad. And everything that's good. I mean, we were trying to be fair. But the fact is, if you're going to do protests like that, if you're going to get Facebook flash mobs to show up, how are you going to keep some people from being vile? And how do you judge the group as a whole when there are some bad actors within it? Same thing comes up with respect to the Tea Party. People that don't like the Tea Party will go right up to the worst sign, the one that shows, Obama with, I don't know what.
Bone through his nose.
Yeah, and then that's the one you see everywhere, and then that's used to tar everybody. So that's a danger with protests, but I think it's important for everyone to realize that the protest is made up of individuals, and we have to keep our wits about us and be fair. But the one thing is, if we're fair, will they be fair to our side? They won't be. They expect us to say, take responsibility for anything bad that goes on our side, and then the other side is free to do anything it wants and expects us not to hold them responsible for it. So I'd like to see it go 2 ways, but it's never going to work out that way. People use whatever raw material they have, basically. This is
one of the joys of not having a side, obviously. But in your estimation, how would you describe the treatment by the protesters of the Capitol? What was your sort of summation, your broad view, as opposed to your individual masking tape incidents?
It's very hard for me to say. I think they went too far. I mean, I think it was just crazy to go on day after day with chanting and constant noise and banging on drums and signs taped up everywhere. I think it was somewhat disrespectful of the building, but I do think there's also a larger free speech interest. I was very influenced by talking to Ben Maisel. Do you know who he is? He died recently. He was very involved in the marijuana legalization movement and a lot of free speech things, mostly centered here in Madison. And he died of lung cancer, actually, just a few weeks ago. But he was very involved in these free speech matters, and I talked to him a lot about the protests and so forth, and so forth. And there have been issues going all the way back, to the Vietnam protest era that he was involved in. That had to do with fighting for free speech rights, specifically in the forum that is the state capitol. And there's a lot of strong case law here about what you can do. When you can just spontaneously have a big rally on the Capitol Square. I mean, it's exactly the opposite of this Ober-Wetter v. Hiller D.C. Circuit, the decision about the Jefferson Memorial. This idea that the people have a right to come down onto the public property and to use exactly the thing that is a great framework for their protest, to just be very expressive. I think it could be a little frightening at times. I mean, there were death threats, and there was a real attempt to prevent the legislature from operating. There was a huge collision of interests and rights and safety issues, security issues, that's really hard to untangle. So I want to stay in the middle on this one and just keep observing and talking about it. I don't want to condemn the people that did. I think to a large extent they did a great job considering the numbers and the depth of the passion in not being destructive. But, they bent some big brass hinges on a 100-year-old building and kicked in some door panels and stormed in through windows late at night. They slept, they camped out in huge numbers inside the building and deliberately wanted to stop the legislature from operating. I mean, it was pretty extreme, but considering the numbers and the passion, it's also really amazing that it was as peaceful and positive as it was.
I am heartened to hear that Wisconsin has some pretty strong protections for free speech in its most political and public places, since I think, if you leave politicians to their own devices or political parties, if they had a chance to rewrite the rules, it probably wouldn't look so nice. In my example here is I've been to the last 3 presidential election cycles worth of the major party political conventions starting in 2000, and that is just about the most kind of disgusting spectacle in which they literally at every site have a freedom cage.
Oh, that's disgusting.
We're like, razor wire around it.
They got to put their speakers in the cage because they just blather.
No, it's truly awful. I mean, you look at it and there's no sense of sort of self-awareness or irony behind it, and it's just awful. I mean, if this is what the Republican Party and Democratic Party, I firmly believe, would do if they had a chance to sort of write the rules from scratch. Here's your cage, have fun, you're outside the armed perimeter, and no one's going to pay any attention to you.
And meanwhile, they are having a phony convention that's just about these canned speeches where nothing really happens anymore. There's no reason to even have the convention except to claim this television time so they can just spew their usual speeches that we all know what they're going to say in advance. So it's actually the protesters who have something interesting to do. But they don't want anything to happen. They want to keep this complete control and claim the press coverage of something that is really a non-event.
Yeah, it's super non-event. I mean, what it is a media convention in many ways. It's sort of like, I mean, there's some people like the cartoonist Tom Tomorrow, who I basically only see at political conventions. Like, hey, nice to see you again, that kind of thing. But it's, there's 15,000.
Yeah, next time you see him, tell him to trace photographs better. I don't like the way he did mine.
Oh yeah, how did you come out?
He just traced things wrong and put the lines where, something was in a photograph that he saw as something to be outlined, and he didn't do it properly. I mean, if your level of drawing is at the level of taking other people's photographs and tracing them, you ought to do at least a better job and make it look a little less like a trace photograph.
Did you get an autographed copy of it at least from the artist?
No. He used a photograph that I think I took using, like the camera and the computer to get a profile picture or something like that. So he used my photograph, traced it badly. Thanks a lot, Tom Tomorrow. All right, I got my personal vendetta out. Anyone you?
You also have a personal vendetta against Google, or at least somewhat. What's that all about?
I had an ongoing couple of discussions with Bob Wright here on Blogging Heads where we talked about free speech. And Bob Wright was going on about Fox News and so on, but an issue that I brought up was that free speech is a value that extends beyond government, a value that the individual holds against government. Obviously, as a matter of constitutional rights, we have our rights against government. So if we talk about free speech rights in that legal sense, the rights are against government. But I was saying free speech is a larger value that also exists vis-a-vis certain kinds of private entities. And in particular, I wanted to point out Google. I mean, Google is the biggest force on the internet right now, right? Google is also YouTube and Blogger, where I blog. And the control, the access to our information, and they're trying to pull even more of it in as they roll out this new cloud approach to computing, where all your stuff will be in their system. So I just wanted to raise the issue of Google as a free speech matter. Now, my personal problem that I had last week was, well, Blogger had some immense problem. They were rolling out some new software, whatever, new features, and the whole thing locked up. And so people weren't able to make their blogs work. But at the same time that happened, my blog went down completely to the point where if you went to my URL, you got a page that said this blog has been removed. Well, that was very upsetting to my commenters, and they didn't communicate with me. I didn't know why that happened. I have, 7.5 years of posting up on my Blogger blog, which is like more than 20,000 posts, and like a 250,000 comments that people have written in the back pages. So that's this huge body of work of mine that I was relying on Google to keep up there online. Oddly, one reason I stayed with Google rather than setting up my own individual site was that I'm pretty old, and I just imagine I want my archive to be up there after I die. And if I'm not there to keep paying for a private website, how will my stuff remain alive? It's sort of like the afterlife. It's like Google is God, and that was my vision of the afterlife, was that my archive would remain up. And then the whole thing just was suddenly wiped away, kind of obliterating that idea of mine with no communication to me, no way to reach Google. There's no contact information. The closest thing you can do is go to this Google forum and write a little post up on their "something is broken" section. And then when you do that, nobody from Google comes in. In fact, what you get is like some sort of regular user who's kind of gotten some sort of ability to funnel complaints into the gate. It's like this private person who was actually quite abusive to me was a gatekeeper for Google. It's like, how can I even interact with Google? There's no process. I mean, if it was the government, there would be a sense that maybe I had a property right and that I had some due process rights or I had some free speech rights. But if I've given myself over into the Google system where Google is supporting me, of course, Google is handing things out for free, kind of like the way the government does, right? And you've fallen into the embrace of this wonderful don't be evil thing that is Google, but then if they cut you off, I mean, they can make you a non-person. If Google decides you're a non-person, what happens to you in this world,
Well,
it's a disturbing thing, and it was grueling for me, and I still don't have my archive back. I've got my blog displaying it again, but only with new posts I can write on it, but my whole 7.5 years of archive is not displayed. Now, I know they tell me they're involved in restoring it. I've been able to get some response from them, but it's really been a harrowing experience to realize how much I and lots of millions of billions of people have given themselves over to all of these wonderful services that Google has beneficently rolled out for us over the years. But do we understand how vulnerable we've made ourselves in that process?
Well, it sounds like you've learned. I mean, I do agree with you as a preamble, and this goes against some Reason readers' belief that free speech as a concept does extend beyond the confines of what you can and can't do vis-a-vis the government, and what the government more specifically can and can't do vis-a-vis you. I think there is such a thing as the culture of free speech, which is also extremely, extremely important, so that, for example, when the entire American media chickens out on even putting Mohammed in a bear costume or depicting someone else putting Mohammed in a bear costume, even though it's all their private decisions, we suffer as a climate of free speech in this country, and it makes it incumbent, I think, on people who value those traditions to engage with those ideas more. All that said, I mean, you engaged in a transaction here. I mean, you got stuff for free for 8 years or however long it's been, 10 years, and it's not as if no one ever had suggested to you, I'm pretty sure, hey, maybe you ought to think about backing up those archives. You're like, it's too much work, blah, blah, blah. Well, these things come at a cost. And to answer your question, what happens when, an Althouse is disappeared by Google, or when more people do? Well, Google's going to have a PR problem, and they're going to lose market share. And one of the reasons why they've been successful is that they generally avoid that kind of crap. I mean, I use Gmail, I've like reoriented all my email system there after using 500 different email clients over the years, where I would download on my computer just because it works better. The spam filter works better. All the stuff works better. Yes, I am vulnerable, and yes, I build in.
And Google has all your email.
Backing
has
up
access to all of your things.
And I am able to, just today, for example, because Google has all my emails, we can have this conversation. My computer sort of semi-crashed earlier today, and as you know, we almost canceled this thing. So I went to a colleague's computer and used Gmail there to look for your phone number, which is on that email string, and to say, hey, I don't think I can do this, and then it turns out I could, blah, blah, blah. But there's a utility. I'm getting something out of that transaction, and I'm doing it with my eyes open enough, maybe not as much as they totally should be, but that, hey, look, there are pluses and minuses for voluntarily, privately giving up some theoretical privacy and some actual privacy for a company that does great things with my information. And Google does wonderful things with information, generally speaking. So I'm all for raising awareness of vulnerability and all that kind of stuff, and keeping pressure on Google not to act like a bunch of jerks about various free speech issues in this country and others. But I don't see Google as a threat to my free speech in any meaningful sense.
Well, if you don't see it, that might be a vulnerability. But we can say, well, I'm becoming more aware of my vulnerability, but there are billions of people in the world who are going into the Google embrace, and Google is such a vast operation. The internet is so important that I'm just not buying the idea that because it's free, you have to accept whatever happens to you. The government does a lot of things for us, and do we just accept them? I think that there are values of privacy.
In a way that Google is not extracting our money. It's a pretty
well, that's true. That's true. Google, if Google says don't be evil, but if Google wanted to be evil, don't be evil, evil would be a good slogan for that. And giving things away for free and bonding huge numbers of people, that's phase one. What's phase two is Google runs the entire world or whatever.
Well, we've seen this kind of
to tie this back to the beginning of the conversation. When you take a job, you're working as a maid or a servant. You now have given up some of your rights because you have your interest in that job. Well, when you go into Google, you put all of your things into that, you're giving up something, and people can say, well, you consented to their terms of service, and now you get what you get your side of the deal. There was good that you got, and then there's bad that comes along with it. But so many people are swept into this. It's a vast change in the whole culture. It changes. You were talking about the culture, the values that people have about free speech. There are also the values that people have about privacy. And these are changing as we give a private corporation access to so much of our most private things, our love letters, our sexual proclivities, and all kinds of things of that sort are in the possession of a company that we're just trusting to care about us. But it has to deal with, even if it wants to care about us, you can't care, and it's not God, and it can't care individually about billions of people around the world. It's not possible. In fact, the people have conflicting interests in a way that it's not possible. And one of Google's propositions, one of the terms of service, is you're not allowed to have hate speech. Well, who decides what that hate speech? If they decide what you wrote is hate speech and they destroy your work, well, what's the answer? Well, you submitted yourself to their judgment of what is hate speech, and you put your work there for free, and so now it's all gone. Now the profile you built for yourself, all the links that you got from other blogs in your work, that's all now gone because Google heard from some people who thought you were writing hate speech, and Google decided to agree with them, and now that's the end of your persona. You're a non-person in Google, and if you're a non-person in Google, well, you've lost a lot of your work. You've lost a lot of what you've worked to establish.
I am old enough to remember when AOL Time Warner was going to end the wild zone of internet freedom, I believe was one of the phrases used at the time. There has always been the digital big brother out there that people have been scared of and been predicting, the collapse of our freedom to do things. And in almost every case, they themselves lose their market share, trip up. We were talking about Microsoft 10 years ago was going to swallow the internet whole. Well, that didn't really work out the way that they had planned. And I'm confident that if Google got into the business of disappearing people and policing hate speech, that Google would soon go out of business, and that there would be enough warning that people would be able to start shifting, start backing up their archives, which you should do, and now, anyways. And so I'm not as worried, although I agree that people should know, have their heads about them as they engage in these transactions, and do not depend on the good graces of someone who isn't your family. So
I agree with you that the free market, which is what you're saying, and of course there's the whole free speech as a free market. The free market is better than the government trying to. I'm not saying the government shouldn't regulate Google. I'm not saying the government should regulate Google. I also like the free speech approach or the free market approach, working the way you just described. I think that is good. I think part of the free market is the free speech about Google, warning people about vulnerabilities, putting pressure on Google to do things right, having these options that people can switch to so it isn't just a big old monopoly. So I think that is good. But mainly I want to say that it's important what values the culture does have. I mean, you were saying that it's important for the culture to have free speech values. And I wanted to say, just as a law professor, that the actual rights that you have in the law are going to depend over time on people actually having those values. If people don't think free speech or free market or whatever is an important value, then the law, as it's interpreted by the courts, is really going to change over time. And same thing with privacy rights. And we're talking about Google in relation to privacy rights, how much information of ours they have. If people over time lose a feeling that privacy matters because they're used to just giving it all over to this private company, then I think that will affect what kinds of privacy interests are retained within various interpretations of the law. So the culture of what people think about free markets and free speech and privacy is all changing and developing and being reinforced or undermined all the time. And it's crucially important. Everything depends on that.
Since that was beautifully said, and I agree with 87% of it, let's end there, Anne.
Okay. So we didn't get to talk about you didn't want to talk about any Republican candidates. They're all boring anyway.
They're not all boring. Actually, they're interestingly weird this time around. But we can save that for next time. We hit the 1 hour limit. But
okay.
Awesome.
Okay,
hopefully
cool.
the tech works out, and I hope you get your archives back.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Bye, Anne.
Great talking to you.